Hey there. Tonight we're going to do something a little unusual. We're not trudging through muddy fields, we're not boiling our underpants in lye, and we're not fighting rats for a place on the straw pile. No, tonight we're rich. Really rich. But not in the modern, yacht-owning, crypto-flipping sense. We're going back to the Middle Ages, roughly between the 5th and 15th centuries, to find out what it meant to be wealthy in a world without stock markets, Bugattis, or Forbes lists. And spoiler alert, it's not quite what you might expect. Because while medieval millionaires didn't scroll Zillow looking for their third vacation castle, they did have other, let's call them quirky flexes. In a world where most people didn't even own shoes, having a fork could make you a show-off. A glass window? Suspiciously fancy. And don't get me started on having your own toilet. So dim the lights, tuck yourself into your metaphorical feather-stuffed bed, probably stolen from a noble aunt. And let's spend the night imagining life not as a poor peasant named Alfred who smells like goat, but as a fabulously wealthy someone who might still smell like goat, but on purpose. Welcome to the world of medieval millionaires. Let's start with a question modern millionaires never ask themselves. What even is money? In the Middle Ages, this was not a philosophical exercise. It was a real logistical nightmare. If you were fabulously wealthy in, say, 1342, your money might take the form of actual sacks of silver pennies, gold florins, or even bundles of wool. Because here's the fun part. Cash was kind of optional. Medieval wealth was measured less in crisp banknotes, which didn't exist, and more in land, livestock, and how many other people had to do things for you when you snapped your bejeweled fingers. The richer you were, the more complicated it got. Coins were precious and rare. They weren't something peasants kept in their pockets. They didn't have pockets. Most people lived in a barter economy where money meant a chicken, a loaf of bread, or a basket of turnips, possibly all on fire. So if you were rich enough to use coins at all, you were already in the top 1%. But there was a catch. Coinage wasn't standardized. A silver penny in France didn't weigh the same as one in England, and the German ones often had enough alloy in them to double as a paperweight. And since literacy was rare, you couldn't even read the coins. You had to bite them. That's right. The famous gold bite wasn't just showmanship. It was quality control. Want to store your wealth? No banks yet. Maybe a locked chest in your bedroom. Maybe a hole in the ground with a very loyal, very quiet priest. Or, if you were smart, you turned your coins into plate. Silver goblets, gold rings, elaborate belt buckles shaped like dragons, because you could wear your savings. Medieval financial planning, but make it fashion. And forget about credit cards. If you owed someone money, it was recorded on a wooden tally stick. One piece for the debtor, one for the creditor. They'd break it down the middle, like medieval Venmo with kindling. No wonder fraud was common. So being rich meant dealing with a chaotic patchwork of coins, random measurements, and the constant fear that someone might melt down your favorite candlestick and sell it to a monk. Luxury, right? So you're a millionaire in the Middle Ages. Congratulations. You're not just the talk of the village, you are the village. And to celebrate your unfathomable wealth, you've built yourself a castle. A big one, with turrets, and maybe a moat. Because if there's one thing rich people loved back then, it was the architectural equivalent of yelling, "Please rob me, I dare you." But here's the thing no minstrel ballad will tell you. Owning a castle in the Middle Ages was kind of a nightmare. Not for the peasants outside, they were already having a rough go of it, but for you, the rich person, because being a medieval lord meant living inside what was basically a fortified refrigerator. Let's start with the basics. Heating. Castles were made of stone, not cozy cottagecore stone, chilly, soul-sapping, echo chamber stone. Once that November wind hit your tower, you might as well be living inside a particularly judgmental cave. Fireplaces helped, but only slightly. Most of the heat went straight out the chimney, and you could freeze solid 2 feet away from a roaring blaze while the smoke lovingly ashed your eyebrows. And yes, you had servants, lots of them, to stoke those fires. But also to keep the rushes on the floor clean-ish, chase out the rats, and refill your goblet with wine every 5 minutes because, surprise, your well water probably has something dead in it again. Next, privacy. You'd think a castle with 40 rooms would be a haven of solitude, but no. You shared those rooms with your family, your steward, your chaplain, your steward's chaplain, and enough extended cousins to start a chess tournament. Your great hall wasn't just for feasting. It doubled as a town square, courtroom, sleeping quarters, and sometimes a location for surprise duels. Your bed, while grand and covered in fabric that cost more than most villages, was also a bit of a medical hazard. Feather mattresses? Absolutely. But they were stuffed with bird fluff and dreams and had the unfortunate tendency to attract things. Living things. The kind that crunch when you roll over at night. Oh, and don't get too smug about that indoor toilet, the garderobe, a vertical shaft built into the outer wall of the castle so your business could plop down into the moat below. It was innovative, yes. It was also extremely breezy in winter and deeply vulnerable to enemy soldiers with a ladder and poor life choices. Some attackers genuinely tried climbing up through the toilet chute. Imagine dying for a kingdom that way. Still, a castle was more than just a cold, overpriced hazard zone. It was a symbol, one visible from miles around. You might not have Wi-Fi or wallpaper, but by heaven, you had status. Guests came from afar, if only to marvel at the view, the size of your tapestries, or your inexplicably large collection of pewter spoons. Entertaining was constant. Nobles dropped by uninvited. Hosting a feast wasn't a fun dinner party. It was a multi-day performance involving live animals, jugglers, rotting meat pies, and at least one guest who insisted on comparing everything to the Norman conquest. And then there were the defenses. If you were lucky, you had a drawbridge and a murder hole, a charming architectural feature designed to let you pour boiling oil onto invaders without making eye contact. If you were really lucky, you never had to use it. But the fear of siege was real. Every castle owner, even the wealthiest duke, knew that all it took was one ambitious neighbor with a small army and a grudge. And suddenly you're trapped inside your own house, rationing oatcakes and regretting your moat-depth decisions. So yes, being rich in the Middle Ages got you a castle, but that castle was cold, crowded, expensive to maintain, and occasionally full of flaming arrows. It was both fortress and financial sinkhole, a symbol of power and a monument to constant stress. But hey, at least you had a roof. You've got the money, the castle, and the peasant tax revenue flowing in like poorly organized wheat. What now? Time to dress the part. Because nothing says I'm absurdly rich in medieval society quite like wrapping yourself in several layers of fabric so extravagant you could single-handedly bankrupt a monastery. In the Middle Ages, fashion wasn't just about style. It was about status, legality, and sometimes how flammable you were. Let's start with the basics. If you were rich, your clothes didn't come from the market stall or your cousin's spinning wheel. They came from tailors, who were practically artists. You weren't wearing a tunic. You were wearing a statement. Rich medieval fashion was all about displaying wealth in visible, excessive, often highly inconvenient ways. Think sleeves so long they needed assistance, shoes so pointy they were banned in churches, hoods with tails longer than your horse. Color mattered. Poor folks wore brown, gray, or beige, colors that politely said, "I rolled in mud and it stuck." But rich people wore blue, and red, and green. Deep, bold colors made with expensive dyes, extracted from crushed insects, boiled roots, and the tears of overwhelmed dyers. Indigo came from distant lands and was priced accordingly. Want to really show off? Try purple, that old imperial color made from sea snails. If your robe screamed, "I smell faintly of mollusk," you knew you were doing it right. Then there was fur, not just for warmth, but as wearable proof that you'd never personally skinned a squirrel. Ermine was top tier, white with little black tail tips, worn by royalty and people pretending to be royalty. Other popular options included beaver, fox, marten, and anything else that ran through the forest and looked expensive when dead. Furs were often worn inside out, with the soft part touching your skin, the medieval equivalent of wearing cashmere pajamas under your armor. Speaking of armor, even that got fancy. Wealthy knights didn't just have functional gear, they had custom fit, engraved, polished to blind your enemy's armor. If you were really fancy, your helmet had a decorative crest, a lion, a dragon, a goose with opinions, to show off both your house symbol and your excellent taste in animal metaphors. Now remember, fashion wasn't optional. Sumptuary laws regulated what you could wear based on your rank. If you were a merchant and wore a nobleman's fabric, trouble. If a servant wore ermine, scandal. These laws were strict, often ridiculous, and absolutely ignored by anyone who could afford the fine. And shoes. Let's not forget the glorious impracticality of medieval footwear. The poulin, a long, pointy shoe that could extend over a foot past your actual toes, was all the rage among the elite. They weren't for walking. They were for waddling dramatically and getting caught on furniture. The longer the point, the richer the wearer, which led to nobles needing garters just to keep their shoes from flopping. No one ever said wealth was supposed to make sense. Jewelry? Of course, rings on every finger. Girdles, think fancy waist belts, adorned with gemstones and tiny purses. Brooches that could double as small weapons. Wealthy women wore elaborate head coverings with wires, veils, and fabric towers known as hennins. Those cone hats that look like they came from a wizard's costume party. Wearing one indoors made your neck sore. Wearing one outside made you a weather vane. And what did all this luxury get you? Respect, admiration, envy, and the constant risk of being accused of sorcery if you looked too good. Especially for women. There are actual cases of women being investigated by the church because they were suspiciously well dressed. That's right. Medieval fashion was a spiritual hazard. So yes, being a millionaire meant you looked magnificent, like a walking tapestry stitched by angels, dyed in royal blood, and trimmed in velvet. You were uncomfortable, impractical, and possibly committing a fashion crime, but you were rich. And in the Middle Ages, that meant being visibly better than everyone else, even if it meant tripping over your own shoes on the way to dinner. Ah, dinner time. You've paid your taxes, looked down from your tower, adjusted your beaver-trimmed robe, and now it's time to eat, like the medieval millionaire you are. But if you're imagining candle-lit tables with quiet elegance, a glass of claret, and some tasteful lute music in the background, think again. A medieval feast, the real showpiece of wealth and power, was less MasterChef and more Game of Thrones meets Barnyard Explosion. Let's start with scale. A proper noble dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a performance, a social ladder, and a logistical crisis all rolled into one. You didn't dine privately. You dined publicly in the great hall, surrounded by dozens, sometimes hundreds of guests, relatives, knights, priests, minstrels, and that one awkward cousin who insists on comparing every dish to what they had at the last crusade. The table? Long, wooden, covered with linen if you were fancy, which you were, and arranged with trenchers, not plates, but slabs of stale bread used as edible dishware. These trenchers absorbed meat juices, sauce, and the existential despair of the kitchen staff. At the end of the meal, they might be given to the poor, to dogs, or, depending on your generosity level, just tossed into the fire with a shrug. Now the food. If you were rich, the menu didn't start with salad. It started with spectacle. Picture this: a roast boar's head, teeth bared, eyes replaced with gilded almonds, a whole peacock, roasted and then redressed in its own iridescent feathers, a swan stuffed with herbs, slow-cooked, posed majestically on a platter, and occasionally, yes, set on fire for dramatic effect. Who needs appetizers when your meal doubles as performance art? Other hits included heron, crane, porpoise, yes, the sea mammal, and various pies stuffed with things that may or may not bite back. There were jellied eels, spiced rabbit, and stews flavored with saffron, cinnamon, and cloves. Spices so expensive you might as well be seasoning your dinner with coins. And the drinks? Wine, of course. Water was for poor people, or people who wanted to die young. But you didn't just sip your wine. You mixed it with spices and honey, warming it like a medieval mulled cider. Ale and mead were everywhere too, though ideally served weak enough that guests could still recite psalms between belches. You had servants, so many servants, to bring the food, carve the meat, pour the drinks, wipe your fingers, and remind you which sauce was for the heron. Each role had a title: carver, cupbearer, trencher-bearer, sauce-server. It was a kitchen-themed opera with fewer sopranos and more sweating. Now for the utensils, or rather the lack of them. Rich people might have a spoon. They might even have a personal knife, beautifully crafted, maybe jeweled, and used for everything from slicing meat to passive-aggressive table gestures. But forks? That was controversial. In many parts of Europe, forks were considered suspiciously foreign, Byzantine, even sinful. Why use a fork, the logic went, when God gave you fingers? And thus, everyone ate with their hands, carefully, politely, but with fingers nonetheless. You'd wash before and after in special scented water, brought in a silver basin by a servant, whose job title was probably something like hand coordinator. After the meat mountain came the subtleties, not subtle at all. These were dessert-like dishes made to look like other things, a castle made from sugar. A pie that releases live birds when you cut into it, yes, nursery rhyme verified. A marzipan dragon breathing actual steam. Subtleties weren't for eating. They were for showing off your chef's emotional instability and your ability to afford it. And don't forget the entertainment. Between courses, there were jesters, musicians, poets, and animal acts. Sometimes acrobats. Sometimes trained bears. Sometimes monks with a juggling act and suspiciously poor theology. Oh, and seating. It was hierarchical. The lord and lady sat at the high table, literally higher, on a raised platform, under a canopy. Guests were placed in order of importance, and if you were seated too close to the kitchen door, that meant you were one goat away from irrelevance. So yes, being a medieval millionaire meant dining in theatrical chaos. It meant chewing goose beside a dancing bear while your second cousin juggled apples near a flammable centerpiece. It meant eating dishes you couldn't pronounce from animals you hoped were extinct, with spices so expensive they had to be guarded. It was rich, ridiculous, and exhausting. But admit it, it sounds kind of fun. So you've eaten your flaming swan, jingled your bejeweled sleeves, and adjusted your embroidered seat cushion. Now what? Well, in the Middle Ages, being a millionaire wasn't just about property and pork pies. It was also about power. And not the metaphorical kind. We're talking real, sword in your face, land seizing, God on your side, dangerous kind of power. Because wealth and politics were two sides of the same hand-forged coin. If you were rich, you were expected to get involved in running things. Whether that meant administering justice, occasionally with a catapult, serving the king, or plotting to replace him. And here's where things got messy. Let's start with titles. You couldn't just be rich. That was for merchants, and they were barely tolerated by the aristocracy unless they loaned money. in which case they were very tolerated, then suddenly imprisoned. But if you had land, and especially if you had a title, baron, earl, duke, count, or some creatively local variant like Viscount of the Left Valley, you were part of the feudal power structure. This meant people didn't just know you were rich. They owed you things. Taxes, labor, obedience, sheep. So many sheep. Feudal lords were the original middle managers of medieval politics, constantly caught between appeasing the king and keeping their peasants alive long enough to pay rent. If you were too loyal, you got used. Too independent, you got accused of treason. Too rich, and people started inventing rumors about your soup preferences being heretical. Still, politics offered opportunities for influence, for land grabs, for strategic marriages to cousins you only mildly suspected of plotting your doom. You could buy favors, positions, and even pardons. Some nobles collected them like trading cards. Ah, yes, this one forgives me for torching that monastery in 1381. Good times. But there was always a catch. Everyone was watching. Every other rich person in the kingdom also wanted more land, more influence, more fancy chairs at dinner. That meant alliances, betrayals, backroom deals, and the occasional suspicious accident involving a tower window and too much wine. This was especially true in royal courts. If you were rich enough to hang around the king, you were also rich enough to be blamed when things went badly. Treason was a favorite charge. So was sorcery. One minute you're sipping wine at a tournament. The next you're in a dungeon, being asked very firmly to explain why your chickens clucked ominously during Lent. And don't forget inheritance, the medieval pastime that ruined more families than bad soup. Rich nobles might have vast estates, but no clear heir, or too many heirs. Or children who mysteriously disappeared during hunting trips. Some lords had illegitimate children, and by some we mean all, leading to years of lawsuits, duels, and family feuds that made modern reality TV look like preschool nap time. Even the church got involved. Not out of morality, but because the church owned lots of land and wanted more. Bishops and abbots, many of them born into noble families, weren't shy about negotiating land deals, controlling rents, or throwing their weight behind this duke or that baron in exchange for a shiny new chapel. And if you thought being rich protected you, think again. There are plenty of stories, real ones, of nobles who lost their heads, literally and politically. Some got caught plotting against the king. Others lost battles. Some just annoyed the wrong monk with a grudge and a good memory. One wrong move, and your castle was under siege, your friends were suddenly less friendly, and your name was being whispered during Sunday Mass, right after, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's falconry license." But it wasn't all chaos. The truly smart rich knew how to play the long game. They arranged advantageous marriages. They forged quiet alliances with powerful clergy. They hosted feasts, gave gifts, and occasionally paid off entire towns just to stay beloved. And they kept records. Long, detailed, paranoid records. Because in medieval politics, forgetting a name could be fatal, but remembering an insult could buy you an army. So yes, being a rich medieval power player meant you had influence, but also enemies. You had land, but also lawsuits. You had luxury, but also the constant threat of exile, arrest, or a sudden sword duel over inheritance rights involving a duck pond. It wasn't just about surviving winter. It was about surviving everyone else. And if you managed to keep your head on your shoulders, your titles intact, and your family name only mildly scandalous, you were doing better than most. So far, your life as a medieval millionaire has included icy castles, dangerous dinners, and more politics than a holiday family reunion. But there's one more piece of the wealth puzzle we haven't touched yet, and it's divine. In the Middle Ages, wealth didn't just buy you land or loyalty. It bought you salvation. Or at least, the appearance of it. Because if there's one thing the medieval church knew how to do, aside from organizing impressive processions and making peasants nervous, it was turning eternity into an investment opportunity. Let's start with the basics. Sin. Everyone had it. Everyone feared it. And in a world where plague could strike on a Tuesday, and lightning might be interpreted as a divine Yelp review, dying unprepared was a terrifying prospect. Luckily, the church had a solution: indulgences, a sort of spiritual get-out-of-jail card. Say a few prayers, pay a donation, fund a roof for a monastery, and you could shave some time off your stay in purgatory. For the rich, this became a competitive sport. Wealthy nobles didn't just pray, they endowed. They built chapels. They donated gold chalices, jeweled crucifixes, entire libraries of hand-copied Bibles, by monks who were probably very tired. One particularly eager count funded an entire cathedral, mostly because he had a slightly scandalous will and wanted to make sure heaven was less judgmental about it. And if you were feeling especially guilty, you could buy prayers in bulk. Monasteries and convents offered spiritual subscriptions. You paid, and in return, monks would say daily prayers for your soul forever, or until the money ran out. Think of it like spiritual Spotify, only with Gregorian chanting. Of course, some nobles took it further. If you really wanted brownie points with God, you joined a crusade, or, more accurately, you paid someone else to do it for you. Taking the cross became a religious and political move, one that cleansed your sins and improved your public image. Not interested in marching to Jerusalem yourself? Just sponsor a few knights, buy the gear, and pray they don't spend it all on mead. Then there were pilgrimages. Long, uncomfortable journeys to holy sites, often done barefoot, and with the looming risk of blisters, thieves, or divine tests of character, like running into an ex at Canterbury. The rich didn't always make the trip, but they definitely funded others to do it on their behalf. That way, they got the heavenly credit without the inconvenience of Swampfoot. Churches themselves became billboards for wealthy souls. Walk into a medieval cathedral, and you'd see lavish tombs, stained glass windows donated by Lady So-and-so, and chapels carved with the faces of noble patrons looking pious, or slightly constipated. Medieval sculpting was tricky. Fun fact, the best burial spots were closest to the altar. The rich paid a lot to be interred there, assuming that proximity to the Eucharist meant better Wi-Fi to heaven. Less wealthy folks had to settle for the back, the courtyard, or, in some tragic cases, under the latrines. And speaking of death prep, the truly paranoid, i.e., everyone with a castle, wrote elaborate wills full of posthumous donations. Upon my death, give 20 marks to the Abbey of St. Splenus, 6 pigs to the nuns at Witherfield, and pay a blind monk to recite psalms daily until Judgment Day, or until he gives up, whichever comes first. Some even left instructions for their own effigies, statues of themselves lying peacefully on tombs, hands folded, eyes shut, swords at their sides. The ultimate medieval flex, looking holy, armed, and unbothered, even in death. But not everyone approved. As the centuries rolled on, some reformers began to question whether buying a stained glass window really canceled out decades of mild tyranny. They asked whether heaven should be a marketplace. The church's answer? Would you like to fund a new bell tower while we discuss that? So yes, being rich in the Middle Ages meant you could, in theory, tiptoe into paradise with a wallet full of gold and a retinue of monks praying you through the pearly gates. But whether it worked? Well, let's just say, if heaven had a velvet rope, the medieval rich definitely tried to tip the doorman. By now, you've mastered the basics of being wealthy in the Middle Ages: castles, fashion, flaming birds, and spiritual investments. But what happens when you've really got money? Like, too much money? Well, then things start to get a little weird. Because once your land is secure, your heirs are mildly threatening, and your local monastery has your name etched into every stone, there's only one thing left to do: flex. And medieval millionaires flexed in the most bizarre ways imaginable. Let's start with exotic pets. Forget about cats or dogs. Those were for peasants and poets. The real rich kept lions. Yes, actual lions. In 13th century England, King Henry III famously kept a collection of exotic animals in the Tower of London, including lions, leopards, an elephant, and possibly the world's most disappointed camel. These weren't private zoo exhibits. These were royal branding. Owning a beast from far-off lands screamed, "I have influence in places you can't even pronounce." Of course, owning exotic animals required special staff, handlers, builders, moat cleaners, and a certain disregard for safety. Many rich folks kept their pets in literal cages, carved into castle courtyards, or paraded them around for guests. It was like a medieval version of showing off your Bugatti, only with more roaring and slightly more poop. Next up, weapons collection. Not for use, mind you. That was for soldiers. Wealthy nobles collected elaborately engraved swords, gilded armor, and helmets with absurdly decorative crests, dragons, antlers, castles, or in one strange case, a cooked goose. These weren't practical. These were conversation starters. You didn't need to fight. You needed people to see you were ready to fight, while also maintaining excellent style. Then there were the feasts that weren't even meant to be eaten. Some nobles commissioned illusion dishes, like roast pigs sewn back together with birds inside them, or jelly castles complete with edible knights. These weren't meals. They were edible Instagram posts. In one French court, a pie was served that opened to reveal a live band playing from within. And yes, someone had to clean that up afterward. If you were extra ambitious and mildly unhinged, you could get into medieval home renovations. Wealthy lords didn't just improve their castles, they overbuilt them. Extra towers, fake battlements, entire moats added for aesthetic purposes. Some nobles had indoor fountains, elaborate plumbing systems that mostly didn't work, and mural-covered walls depicting saints, dragons, and the odd self-portrait. Because nothing says modesty like immortalizing your jawline in tempera paint above a fireplace. And let's not forget sports. Falconry was the gold standard. Owning a trained falcon was like having a luxury sports car perched on your wrist. Rich women had falcons. Bishops had falcons. Even falcons had falcons. These birds required constant care, training, and a wardrobe of tiny hoods, making them the most high-maintenance accessory of the medieval elite. If birds weren't your thing, maybe jousting was. Knights, especially rich ones, loved tournaments. But these weren't the noble, chivalrous affairs Hollywood suggests. They were chaotic, dangerous, and often fatal. Broken limbs were common, so were lawsuits. Nobles participated anyway, because a good jousting win could boost your reputation faster than any LinkedIn endorsement. And then there were insults as entertainment. Some nobles kept jesters whose job wasn't just to be funny, it was to mock other nobles, insult the clergy, and say the things no one else dared. All while wearing bells on their hats. If you were very rich, you might even fund a fool's feast, where servants sat at the high table and lords acted like kitchen staff. A weird medieval version of undercover boss meets social experimentation. Of course, being this extra came with risks. Your wealth and flair could easily draw the wrong kind of attention. Jealous neighbors, bored kings, or priests with a long memory. One too many peacock parades, and suddenly you're under investigation for vanity, sorcery, or both. So what did medieval millionaires do for fun? They showed off. They dressed like saints, fed guests like emperors, and kept animals that would definitely void any modern insurance policy. Because in a world where most people lived in fear of the next harvest, Being able to throw a party where your dessert recited poetry was the ultimate power move. And if you could do it while wearing a leopard skin cape and feeding your lion table scraps, even better. Until now, our medieval millionaire has mostly worn a crown, lived in a drafty fortress, and occasionally jousted with cousins over land and soup. But not every rich person in the Middle Ages was a noble waving from the turret. Some were far more dangerous. They were rich without being born rich. Enter the merchants, the self-made, town-dwelling, contract-writing, wool-counting, wine-exporting titans of late medieval Europe. These were the 99% of the 1%, the people who didn't inherit titles, but clawed their way up the muddy socioeconomic ladder with ledgers, contacts, and an ungodly number of shipping receipts. Let's be clear. Being a rich merchant was not the same as being a noble. You couldn't wear ermine unless you wanted a visit from the sumptuary police. You didn't have a castle. At best, you had a very nice stone townhouse above your counting room. But what you did have was money. Real, fluid, usable money. So how did merchants get rich? Trade, mostly. Lots and lots of trade. Some dealt in cloth, others in wine, spices, furs, salt, timber, or those overpriced glass beads everyone kept losing. The truly bold ones went international, joining massive trading guilds like the Hanseatic League, a sort of medieval Costco meets mafia, only with more cargo ships and fewer free samples. These merchants had fleets, they had warehouses, they had contracts in 4 languages, and enough silver coin to make a bishop nervous. Some dabbled in banking, lending to nobles who didn't understand interest rates and couldn't read the fine print. Others bought debts from cities or monarchs and collected them with cheerful ruthlessness. You know, for fun. But being rich and untitled had its challenges. For one thing, nobles hated you. You had their money, but not their bloodline. And that made you annoying. Some nobles refused to deal with merchants directly. Others took their money and pretended not to know them. Occasionally, a merchant would marry into a noble family, but only if they brought a dowry big enough to finance a war and a small cathedral. Then there was respectability. Merchants were constantly proving they weren't just wealthy, but virtuous. They donated to churches, built hospitals, commissioned chapels, and made sure everyone knew about it. Not out of spiritual panic. Well, not only, but because public charity was one of the few ways to turn coin into credibility. Some cities even built entire guild halls, elaborate buildings where merchants could gather, hold meetings, and complain about grain tariffs over lukewarm ale. These were more than offices. They were power centers. If nobles had courts, merchants had contracts, written, sealed, filed in triplicate, and they worked. Let's not forget fashion either. Merchant wealth may not have allowed silk robes with gold frogs stitched into the hem, but it pushed boundaries. Rich traders wore deep blues, muted reds, and the occasional illegal brocade under a very legal-looking overcoat. Buttons were a popular flex. The more buttons on your doublet, the more coins in your pouch. It was the medieval equivalent of wearing a designer hoodie to a board meeting, humble on top, scandalously expensive underneath. And travel? Merchants traveled constantly. To Bruges, Venice, Genoa, London. If nobles were rooted in land, merchants were mobile. They followed trade winds, avoided pirates, or hired them, and often knew more about foreign currencies than their kings. Many spoke Latin, French, Italian, and accountant. Their wealth was liquid, not tied up in sheep and inheritance disputes. But with wealth came risk. A shipwreck could ruin you. A war in Flanders might close a port. A new tax could wipe out a year's profits. One badly worded letter or broken contract could spark a legal battle with the church, the crown, or a particularly litigious spice vendor. And still, they grew richer. Some became so influential they ran cities. In places like Florence, Wealthy merchant families like the Medici rose from bankers to rulers to popes, blending business, politics, and divine approval in one fabulously embroidered package. So no, they didn't have castles, they had banks, they didn't have swords, they had lawsuits. They weren't born with titles. But by the 15th century, they were buying them. The medieval merchant millionaire was cunning, cosmopolitan, and just a little terrifying. Because unlike the nobles, their wealth didn't come from ancient privilege. It came from receipts. So you've survived court intrigue, castle renovations, flaming poultry, and one too many lawsuits over wool tariffs. You're now a medieval millionaire in the twilight of your life. Your joints creak, your falcon ignores you. And you've started referring to younger nobles as that loud boy with the unfortunate mustache. The question is, what now? Because in a world without retirement accounts, beachfront villas, or crossword puzzles, a wealthy medieval person had only a few options, and all of them came with an alarming amount of incense and reflection. Let's start with the first and most respectable path, going religious. This didn't mean you suddenly developed a passion for cold stone floors and Latin chanting, although that sometimes happened. It meant you retired into a monastery or convent, ideally one that you funded yourself, and preferably one that smelled less like sheep and more like sanctity. Wealthy nobles would sometimes donate land, build a chapel, and then move in as a sort of holy guest. They weren't monks, not exactly. More like VIP residents. They got their own cells, warm meals, and a front row seat at all the major feast days. Some even negotiated private confession schedules, a perk when your past included crusade taxes, 3 unofficial marriages, and an incident involving a goose and a wine barrel no one wanted to discuss. Others built chantries, small chapels where priests were hired to pray for their souls full-time, like a divine retirement insurance plan. These priests weren't cheap, but the theory was solid. The more prayers said on your behalf, the better your odds of skipping purgatory. Or at least shortening your stay to something closer to a long weekend. Then there was a state delegation. For the very rich, retirement could mean handing the manor over to your heir, often a son who looked a bit too eager, and keeping a small household in the corner wing of your own castle. You still had servants. You still hosted visitors. You just stopped managing the oat harvest and started focusing on more important matters, like supervising feasts, rearranging your coin collection, or writing deeply passive-aggressive wills. Some rich retirees took up pilgrimage, not out of necessity, but because it was trendy. Walking to Canterbury, or Santiago de Compostela, was the medieval version of going on a spiritual sabbatical, one that came with blisters, relics, and a respectable tan. Of course, if your knees objected, you could always send a proxy. There were literally people whose job it was to go on pilgrimages for you. Spiritual outsourcing at its finest. If you were very rich and very bored, you might decide to start over entirely. Found a town, build a university, write an autobiography full of lies. One noble woman in the 14th century spent her later years commissioning elaborate tapestries of her family's exploits, some of which may have featured dragons for added drama. Why not? It's your legacy. And then there were the memorial projects. Wealthy retirees often spent their final years preparing their own funerals. And not just in the write a nice speech and pick a psalm way. We're talking full-blown theatrical productions. Marble tombs with custom effigies, lead coffins wrapped in velvet, and funeral processions that made entire villages stop and squint. Some even left behind specific funeral scripts, complete with musical cues, and which monks were allowed to chant in Latin, and which ones had to stay quiet because of past theological disagreements. But perhaps the most curious thing about medieval retirement was how serious it became. Because in the Middle Ages, growing old wasn't just a biological inevitability, it was a spiritual countdown. You didn't retire from work. You retired from sin. You simplified. You confessed more. You gave more away. And if you were lucky, you were remembered not for the feast you hosted with a flaming hedgehog centerpiece, but for the hospital you founded afterward. Of course, not every wealthy retiree mellowed with age. Some grew crankier. Some became local legends, wandering the halls in elaborate robes, quoting Aristotle and arguing with bishops. One retired lord was said to spend his last decade writing letters to the king, suggesting new taxes just for fun. Another noblewoman famously turned her entire manor into a sanctuary for injured animals, monks, and slightly confused travelers, all of whom stayed for dinner. So what happened to medieval millionaires when they got old? They either became saints, patrons, or very well-fed ghosts. And in the end, whether buried beneath a cathedral altar or beneath a gravestone with 87 carved cherubs, they left behind something few in the Middle Ages ever could, a name that didn't fade. By now, your medieval millionaire has aged, confessed, commissioned a modest chapel or two, and possibly a marble fountain shaped like a swan, and accepted the inevitable. Death comes for everyone, even the fabulously wealthy. But here's the thing. While the average peasant might leave behind little more than a shovel and a suspiciously named goat, the medieval elite had no intention of fading quietly into the anonymous fog of history. No, they had plans, big ones. Plans involving stone, parchment, legends, and occasionally some light divine bribery. Let's start with the most basic form of posthumous permanence, the tomb. Not just any grave. You didn't get buried in the dirt with the commoners. No, your final resting place was part performance, part architectural project, and part status symbol. If you could swing it, you were interred inside a church, preferably near the altar, and ideally in a location where people would be forced to step over you every time they came to pray. Just a gentle reminder that even in death, you outranked the living. These tombs weren't plain markers either. They were effigies. Life-size stone sculptures of your serene, pious corpse, often carved with a sword at your side, your hands folded in eternal prayer, and just a whisper of smugness in the cheekbones. Some nobles had themselves depicted twice, one effigy as they were in life, noble, armored, alert, and another beneath it as a rotting skeleton with worms crawling through the ribs. Just a little memento mori to keep things humble. Then there were libraries. A rich noble might donate manuscripts to a monastery, not just for the monks' benefit, but so that their name would be copied into the dedication page of every single book. Forever, you didn't just give the library a psalter. You gave it Lord Reginald de something Psalter, with a note in Latin saying, essentially, "You're welcome." Others commissioned chronicles, handwritten histories that just happened to make them look very, very good. Some of these were factual-ish. Others were more imaginative, turning minor skirmishes into noble victories and family trees into mythological forests. Yes, my grandmother was a dragon-slaying princess. No further questions. You might also build foundations, almshouses for the poor, hospitals for the sick, bridges, fountains, market halls, all carved with your name and coat of arms. These serve two purposes. 1. Genuine charity. 2. Ensuring that no one ever crossed a river or bought a turnip without remembering who made it possible. Legacy, after all, loves traffic. And then, of course, came the legends. Because what better way to live forever than to become the subject of bedtime stories, ballads, and suspiciously biased miracle accounts? Some medieval millionaires became patron saints, or at least tried to. They sponsored relics, built churches, performed just enough piety, and then politely waited to be canonized. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Either way, they often ended up in local folklore. Lord Geoffrey, who once survived a boar attack by quoting Psalms. Lady Alison, whose hair glowed with divine light during storms. Possibly true, probably not. but effective branding. Others became ghosts. Not literally, though in some castles, who knows, but metaphorically. Their names echoed through charters, songs, legal records, and family stories. Centuries later, you might still hear about the duke who fed 1,000 people during a famine, or who once rode his warhorse up the steps of the cathedral because he was feeling spirited. Some even commissioned portraits, a rare luxury in a world before oil paintings were common. These were often stiff, flat, and artistically questionable, but they existed. And in a time when the vast majority of people would vanish without a trace, having your face survive was a kind of immortality. And finally, there were the names, the titles, the land grants, the carved inscriptions in stone that, for centuries, whispered, "I was here, I mattered, and I had a lot of money." Because if death was inevitable, then legacy was the true final currency, and the medieval millionaire knew how to spend it. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the rarefied air of medieval millions, or florins, or marks, or wool bales, depending on the decade, and the lord in question. We've traveled through freezing castles and flaming banquets, walked halls lined with peacocks and prayers, and watched fortunes rise, not just with the sword, but with the spoon. We've met noblemen in gold-embroidered hose, and merchant women whose ledgers held more power than any lance. We've peeked behind cathedral walls, under velvet canopies, and into the anxious dreams of those who had everything except immortality. Because in the end, no matter how much you owned, land, jewels, leopard skin prayer cushions, time still collected its rent. And yet, in some quiet, oddly touching way, these medieval millionaires live on. In the churches they built, the songs they paid to have written, the tapestries where they stare at us blankly from horseback. In the stories passed down, exaggerated, misremembered, sung over campfires, of grand feasts, impossible pets, and tragic duels over swans. Their names might be cracked in stone, their portraits faded, but the absurdity, ambition, and strangely endearing humanness of it all, that lingers. So next time you're stuck in traffic behind a luxury car with a custom plate, or you see someone showing off their perfectly color-coordinated bookshelf on social media, just smile. Because deep down, it's the same story, only with fewer falcons. Good night, noble friend. Sleep well. And if your dreams include a jeweled fork or a pet lion, well, that's entirely on brand.